Well, good morning and welcome. Good afternoon to our friends joining us from the East Coast or elsewhere around the world. My name is Dr. Katie Clark, and on behalf of the California and Northwest chapters of the Patrons of the Arts in the Vatican Museum, I'm so pleased to welcome you to the first in our four-part lecture series beginning this morning. We're so pleased to have you with us. So many of our patrons and our fellow restorers from all of the chapters around the world, as well as, of course, our collaborators on this series, the Friends of the Uffizi Gallery. We're delighted to welcome all of you. And for some of you who are meeting these two organizations for the first time, you're really in for a treat because there is nothing that they like to talk about more than restoring, preserving, and caretaking some of the greatest art collected in some of the greatest museums in the world. So thank you so much for being with us. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you our lecturer for this morning and for the four-part series we're about to embark on. Fantastic art historian, cognoscenti of all things Italian art. Please welcome Dr. Rocky Ruggiero. Hi, Rocky.
Hey, Katie. Thank you for that great introduction. Thank you, the California and Northwest chapters of the Patron of the Arts in the Vatican Museums, for having me back. It's hard to believe that it's actually been a year since we were last connected, obviously via the internet. I'd also like to give a big special thank you and ciao to my friends at the Friends of the Uffizi Gallery as well, for helping take part in the organization of all this four-part series, where essentially we're sort of combining the legacies and the patronage of two of the most important families of the Renaissance, which of course are the della Rovere family and the Medici family as well. And so I thought I would sort of kick off in a rather enigmatic way. And I mean that most literally, because the painting that we are discussing today does still continue to baffle most of the art historical world as regards its meaning. And this little painting, you can see the dimensions there on the right-hand side of the caption. It's about just under 2 feet tall by just about 2.5 feet wide, painted on wood, is known as the Flagellation, because in fact, it appears that the main subject there in the background of the left-hand side of the painting is in fact the scourging of Jesus Christ. But what has baffled art historians is just exactly who all of the other people are in this particular work. And so I remember as an undergraduate, as a graduate student, as a teaching assistant, and now as a full-grown professional academic, there are just so many theories that abound about this particular work. And what I'd like to do is to sort of use it to kind of introduce what our discussion will be, and that is how the legacies of these two great families, the Della Rovere and the Medici, are in fact intertwined. It will be a bit of a roundabout route that we're taking, but one that I think you will enjoy. And so the artist of the painting, you see, is named Piero della Francesca, who in fact is a giant of the early Renaissance period. He's one of the most important artists in history, but in particular of the 15th century when he was alive. You can see his extremities there. We're not exactly sure when he was born, but we normally put it to the beginning of the 15th century. We do lose all track of him in 1492, so we imagine that that is the year in which he passed away. There's a bit of a legend concerning his name, that he was actually named after his mother, Piero della Francesca, or Piero of Francesca, when in reality, this is really nothing more than a myth. Piero was baptized with the name Piero di Benedetto de Franceschi, right? So his father's family name was de Franceschi. His mother was actually named Romana di Perino da Monterchi, and Monterchi is this little town in southern Tuscany. So because Romana was the wife of a guy known as De Franceschi, whose last name was De Franceschi, she became known as La Francesca. In other words, La Francesca was Piero's mother's nickname that was deduced from her husband's family name. In fact, perhaps the more famous analogous situation would be for a woman known as Mona Lisa Gherardini, but who the Italians refer to as La Gioconda. Remember, Mona Lisa is called La Gioconda in Italian because her husband's last name was Giocondo. So Piero was born of a woman known as La Francesca because of her husband's name, not because it was her first name. And the reason Piero doesn't get as much PR as most other 15th century artists actually do is because there's not that much of his art in the city of Florence or Rome or Venice. Now, I've been on this kick for several months now where much of the popularity of artists is based obviously on the accessibility to their art. And so most people, I think, going to Italy usually follow that tri-city route of Rome, Florence, Venice, Venice, Florence, Rome, or what have you. In fact, in the entire city of Florence, we have one painting by Piero della Francesca. It is a doozy that we'll be talking about in one of my later sessions, and that is the double portrait of the Duke and Duchess of Urbino. And in fact, that painting came into the Uffizi collection via a della Rovere, who was actually ruling over the city of Urbino at the time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk a bit more about the artist and his career before we get to our painting. This is one of Piero's most celebrated works, an altarpiece known as the Montefeltro Altarpiece, because its patron is the gentleman that you see here kneeling in the lower right-hand corner, whose name is Federico da Montefeltro. He was the first Duke of the central Italian city of Urbino. And Urbino is going to play a very important part in our tale over the next 4 weeks or so. In fact, it's generally believed that this was once the high altarpiece of a church in Urbino called San Bernardino, which is actually the resting place of the Duke himself. So not uncommon to actually see the patron of a work appear in the work of art, as you see here with Federico da Montefeltro, dressed in armor with the long sword at his side, because if you don't know, Federico da Montefeltro was the most successful and feared of mercenary generals, or what in Italian we call the condottieri. He was a general for hire. He would fight for the highest bidder for most of the city-states in Italy, which did not have their own standing armies. Standing armies were incredibly rare in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, and so it was much more common to actually hire an army to come in and fight your battles and or wars for you. And in this particular work, you can see Piero at work. In fact, in many ways, Piero della Francesca is sort of considered a forerunner to the great Leonardo da Vinci, right? Because they both have rather scientific angles to the way they approach their painting. And consider that Piero, in fact, was the author of a very important mathematical treatise in the 15th century as well. And I think you can get a sense of this general precision with which he works. He combines this almost frozen geometry in his figures and in his symmetry, and then this incredibly cold, formal light in the painting as well, that gives it this almost metaphysical quality. There's something spiritual about the way everything is rendered in such a precise format. A very beautiful image of the Virgin Mary with her almost photorealistic mantle over her shoulders, this sleeping Christ child across her lap with his coral necklace, symbol of the Passion, but also symbol, of course, of rarity and preciousness, because it was so hard to find. And then the symmetrical arrangements of saints to the left and right, St. John the Baptist, St. Jerome, and then San Bernardino, which remember was the name of the church in which the painting was originally located, John the Evangelist, Francis of Assisi, and then behind him, St. Peter Martyr, with his characteristic wound, bleeding wound on his head. And the architecture back here, and again, folks, forgive me, I'm an architectural historian, so any chance I get, I will celebrate extraordinary representations here of this classically inspired architecture. But perhaps the object that most captures our collective imagination is the egg that you see hanging there. And so oftentimes this painting is referred to as the Madonna of the egg. Now consider that the depth of this painting is such that in order for that egg to appear that large, it would need to be a rather large one. In fact, in all probability, that is an ostrich egg that you see hanging from the shell, and the shell and the egg itself are symbols of rebirth. So if in fact this was a type of funerary altarpiece, what better symbolism, of course, than the symbolism of rebirth. Another of Piero's celebrated works, and I remember as an undergraduate spending considerable time looking at this, but not knowing exactly where it was. I want you all to pay careful attention to the locations of the paintings that I'm showing you, because this one you see is located in the Museo Civico, the Civic Museum of San Sepolcro. All right, now consider that back in the, let's say, 1970s and 80s, one of the more popular things for people to do was to go on the Piero della Francesca trail, they would call it. In other words, you would leave Florence, head to Arezzo, then from Arezzo stop in Monterchi, then Monterchi onto San Sepolcro, and then from San Sepolcro all the way to Urbino, which is where our painting, the Flagellation, is located, to look at all of the major works of Piero, which in fact are concentrated in the southern part of the region of Tuscany. This massive altarpiece, which is still, even though painted in the middle of the 15th century, in a rather outdated and old-fashioned polyptych style. In Florence, 3 years earlier, an artist by the name of Fra Angelico had entirely done away with this format, because this is not modern. Modern Renaissance art would put all of the figures into a same single unified space, because we obey the rules of physics in the Renaissance art that was being created. Instead, Piero, you see, kind of a prisoner of the provincial patron who actually paid for the work, who instead wanted a more traditional format of figures contained within these compartmentalized architectural spaces that you see. And the painting was actually paid for by a confraternity of the same name. Look at the abbreviation down here. So that is the letter M, I, and then A, and that weird sort of omega-like looking symbol is an indication of an abbreviation. Doesn't tell you what letters are missing. You have to figure that out on your own, but the entirety of the word is misericordia. And the misericordia, well, first of all, it's the Italian word for mercy, and it refers to a specific image of the Madonna of Mercy, who actually occupies the central part of the panel. You can see the blow up there on the left-hand side, because through her mercy, she, with her mantle there, protects us all. You see the image of all of her devotees, who are arranged, by the way, in a very sophisticated way for the middle of the 15th century in this semicircular arrangement with figures with their backs to us, to give us a sense of volume and depth in the painting as well. And this, of course, is the result of Piero's deep interest in mathematics and in the science of perspective, which was still a relatively new technology at the time. But perhaps the figure who most captures our attention in this particular work is the one that you see right there, all right? And that is the hooded figure. Rather ominous, almost frightening figure for us in the 21st century. But I want you to remember that this confraternity, which was dedicated to mercy, to misericordia, in fact, had a mission of performing charitable acts for people. One in particular, and that was to succor the sick and injured. So they would run around the towns of Italy. This is not something exclusive to San Sepolcro, but they would run around the towns of Italy wearing hoods, because true charity is anonymous. This is what they thought. And they were the stretcher bearers who, in fact, would run to collect someone who had just been injured or sick and then take them to a hospital. And I want you to realize that the tradition of anonymous charity was one that continued well into the 20th century. Any of you who've been to Florence may remember that right next to the cathedral is this oddly placed ambulance depot. And periodically, suddenly the ambulances just, they scream their sirens on and they just fly right through the crowd. People saying that's an odd place to put an ambulance depot. Well, the reason it's there is because that is the seat of the still extant Misericordia in Florence. In fact, many of my friends, when I lived in Italy for a couple of decades, would volunteer their time as ambulance drivers, so that they are volunteers who go around driving ambulance to pick up people who in fact need to be transported to the hospital. And those ambulance drivers actually wore hoods, believe it or not, up until the 1950s or so, when transmissions from the United States started arriving in Italy, and we saw these really scary looking guys wearing white hoods, right, members of the Ku Klux Klan, and supposedly this would scare Italian children, at which point the tradition of anonymous charity actually disappeared. That's when they stopped wearing these hoods, which appear very often still in Italian art at this particular point. It has nothing to do with evil or bad characters. It has to do with members of the confraternity who wanted to keep their charitable acts anonymous. Right? Another of Piero's celebrated works is located here in the National Gallery in London, and it is his celebrated baptism. Right? Now, you may have noticed that I didn't talk about Piero's artistic training. And the reason is because we're not 100% certain exactly where his development began. We think that he studied under an artist by the name of Domenico Veneziano, who was active in the 1430s and 40s in Florence, despite his name. And the reason is because of the affinity of their styles. This is an extraordinarily beautiful painting by Piero that was done, you see, in 1450. So if we're right about the year of his birth, he's about 35 years, still relatively young artist. And we call this light painting, where essentially the surface of the panel is primed with bright white, and then the paintings themselves become almost translucent in form. This is sort of part of the same effect that we saw earlier in that Madonna of the Egg as well. And this symmetry that he sort of insists upon in geometric organization, so that you have this spectral figure of Christ, and remember that because you'll see that same sort of look in a painting that I'll show you in just a bit, being baptized by John, who serves as sort of vertical division on the right-hand side. To the right of John, this figure presumably preparing himself for baptism, and that gesture of removing his shirt is one that Piero della Francesca borrowed directly from Masaccio's frescoes in the Brancacci chapel, which means that Piero della Francesca was exposed to the revolutionary art that was being produced in Florence in the first half of the 15th century. And the vertical of John is balanced by the vertical tree. So he's dividing this thing up almost into parts, to the left of which you have these three rather casual looking angels who are normally present in a baptism scene to carry the robes of Christ. He is the Son of God, therefore when he disrobes, the angels carry them. Instead, here they look just like a bunch of Italian youths sort of hanging around casually, one with his arm draped over the shoulder of the other, this character looking in the other direction, one looking directly out at us, almost as if they are there, but they're not there for their typical reasons. And this is something that is going to characterize Piero's art, and that is unconventional iconography. But one thing I do want to point out before we continue, look at the reflection that Piero has painted on the surface of the water. And this is that scientific precision that I mentioned before. You can see the clouds here drifting by. You can see the hill reflected. You can see the colors of the robes worn by the figures in the back as well. It's an extraordinary ability that he has to render in an optically precise and, again, almost metaphysical way. Piero did travel. I told you he was in Florence for a while, and he also then makes a trip to Rimini. Now, Rimini is a city that today in Italy is celebrated for its nightlife. This is where a lot of Italians go in the summer. You spend your day at the beach. You spend your nights at the local discotheques, which is a very animated sort of scene. But Rimini actually has some extraordinarily important art, in particular the building that you're looking at right there, which is one of the few structures designed and built by Leon Battista Alberti, perhaps the greatest architectural theoretician of the entire 15th century. It's the Tempio Malatestiano. It is the temple of the Malatesta. And Malatesta was the name of the illegitimate overlord of the city of Rimini. His first name was Sigismondo. The church, and you see it is a church, everyone, despite its name, is dedicated to San Francesco. So some people call it the Church of San Francesco. Some people rather more dramatically or classically, excuse me, referring to it instead as the temple of the Malatesta family. And inside, you find this celebrated fresco by Piero della Francesca of the patron. This is Sigismund, the ruler of Rimini, and also, by the way, a mercenary general. He made so much money, he was able essentially to buy the town, kneeling in front of his namesake saint, Saint Sigismund. And so Piero, again, the painting is quite deteriorated, but you can see the exceptional precision of the perspectival floor, the alternating greyhounds, white and black facing opposite directions, the precision of the architecture behind, and then this profile representation. So clearly the profile position is one that was preferred by patrons at the time because it suggested power, and then the figure of Saint Sigismund in a very naturalistic and realistic depiction here, sitting upon his throne. All right. All right. Now we travel. We're following the Piero della Francesca trail. and we head to the city of Arezzo. And Arezzo is another one of those sort of often overlooked Tuscan towns. There's quite a bit of extraordinary art. In fact, Arezzo's most famous citizen is none other than Giorgio Vasari himself. Remember, Vasari was Aretino. He came from Arezzo, and you can actually visit his home. And in the church of San Francesco in Arezzo, you can see one of the most celebrated works of art of the entire Renaissance, and that is the Fresco Cycle inside of the Cappella Maggiore, that is the high chapel of the church. That was actually sponsored by the Bacci family, inside of which Piero della Francesca paints his famous Legend of the True Cross series. All right. Now, these frescoes were already well known, and I dare say that they might represent Piero's most famous work. In other words, when people think of Piero, I think that a general lay community would think of the paintings here. The reason is because of a book turned movie called The English Patient, written by one of my favorite authors named Michael Ondaatje. It is poetic prose, if I can plug him momentarily. But that book was turned into a movie by the same name, you may remember. And there's that celebrated scene where the French actress Juliette Binoche is hoisted up in the harness, and her Indian lover is swinging her back and forth with the torch, and she's looking at these beautiful frescoes up close. The frescoes in the movie are the frescoes that we're about to look at here in the high chapel of San Francesco, depicting again the so-called Legend of the True Cross, which is a work that is, or I'm sorry, which is a story recounted. I had it here the other day. It's gone. Sorry. In a book, I was looking for the book called The Golden Legend. And if you don't know, all the saint stories are in fact grouped together in a book called The Golden Legend, published in the 13th century. And one of those stories concerns both the origins and the eventual destiny of the so-called true cross. It is the cross upon which Jesus Christ was crucified. So that these frescoes tell the story in a fragmentary way. In fact, if you want to see the full visual story of the Legend of the True Cross, then you visit the Church of Santa Croce in Florence, where an artist named Agnolo Gaddi paints all of the scenes in the high chapel there. But we'll look at Piero's instead. In fact, we call this the Adam wall because of the scene way at the top, which you see here. All right. Now, again, this is all apocryphal. So if you don't remember reading about it in the Bible, it's because it's not there. And the story goes that after the whole Cain and Abel mishap, you remember that didn't go well first time around, that Adam, in fact, fathered other sons, one of whom was named Seth, S-E-T-H. And that when Adam was very, very old and sick, his son Seth, fearful that he was going to die, in fact, was told by an angel that to save his father, he needed to go back into the Garden of Eden and to retrieve a branch from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So here's sick Adam on the right-hand side. Here is dead Adam on the left-hand side, because Seth saw that through, but when he got back, it was too late. Adam was already dead. So what you see him doing is actually dropping 3 seeds from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil into the mouth of Adam before he interred him, before he inhumated him. All right. Now, this is a really fascinating sort of story. What happens is that those seeds would grow into another tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which at a later indiscriminate point, for some reason, just fell over. All right. And when it fell, it actually fell across a river. So this is the scene. Let me back up just to show you really quickly. So we were here. Now we're down here. Okay. It's not easy. If you don't know the story, it's not easy to follow. And the story goes that this tree that had fallen over the river was serving as a bridge. And at one point, the Queen of Sheba was on her way to visit King Solomon when she comes across this fallen tree/bridge and is compelled to drop to her knees and worship it. That's what's happening over here with these very beautiful and fantastical ladies in waiting that Piero has depicted. And then when she finally meets King Solomon, she informs him of what happened. He realizes that there's something important about this particular piece of wood. And so he then takes it and tries to have his workers incorporate it into the temple that he was then building. But no matter how they tried, this piece of wood would just not fit. So he decides to bury it at this point instead, right? And so the tree was interred. You can see it here being put into the ground for protection. This smaller rectangular scene is actually on the back wall of the chapel itself. It remained underground for quite a long time. Now, I'm going to fast forward because the subsequent scenes are actually missing. What happens is it remains underground until around the year 33 Common Era, 33 CE or AD, whichever you prefer, and it starts to wiggle its way to an underground river, and this piece of wood that you just saw buried in the previous scene comes up and makes itself present, so that the Romans decide to take it and to transform it into a cross upon which they can crucify a guy named Jesus of Nazareth. I'm not kidding. The legend maintains that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil indirectly provides the wood for the cross upon which Christ was crucified. And that supposedly Christ's sacrifice redeems Adam's sins. All right, that cross then goes lost after Christ's crucifixion. No one really knows. Fast forward to 312 AD. I know I'm taking you all over the place, everyone, but bear with me. When an ambitious emperor by the name of Constantine decides to make a move on the other than incumbent emperor in Rome, whose name was Maxentius. And the night before his folly attack, there was no way he could win. He was attacking Maxentius on neutral ground. He has a dream, and this is the famous dream of Constantine seen by Piero, in which an angel shows him a cross. You see the angel here? And tells Constantine that in this sign you shall conquer. Right? And here's a detail of, look at the light in here, everyone. Now, this is oftentimes mistakenly identified as the first successful night scene in the history of art. And in reality, it's not. There's an earlier night scene by Gentile da Fabriano, but it is one of the earliest. And the degree of sophistication to the illumination in the scene is without equal in the 15th century. It's astonishing to see someone with such a precise knowledge of color, light, form, the way Piero does in this particular scene. And it is very much worth the trip to Arezzo to see it in person. So the next day, what happens is that Constantine orders all of his soldiers to paint the symbol of the cross on their shields. And everyone thinks he's gone off the deep end, of course. Now, whether it's the Latin cross or whether it's the Chi-Rho, the first two letters of the word Christus in Greek, we don't know. But at that battle of the Milvian Bridge, which is a bridge just outside Rome, Constantine defeats the forces of Maxentius and in fact becomes the first solitary emperor in the West in a couple of hundred years. And there's Constantine, there's the cross that he bears in front of his soldiers. And you can see that almost geometric precision of all the figures in the scene as his foe, Maxentius, falls into the river itself. Okay, what happens? That symbol is what allows him to win. So Constantine's mother, whose name is Helena, takes it upon herself to go back to the Holy Land and to actually try to retrieve, try to discover just where that cross upon which Christ was crucified is located. Right? When she gets there, she finds out that, well, just about everyone's forgotten exactly where it is, except for one guy. And of course, in this sort of anti-Semitic story, the guy happens to be Jewish. He won't talk, though. So Helena, in a very Christian fashion, decides to throw this man into a well and starve him until he's willing to cough up the beans, at which point, you see, they pull him up. That's what's happening here at the very end of the torture. And then he tells them exactly where this cross is located. And when they go to the site and dig, another obstacle, because they find 3 crosses, because all 4 gospels concur that Christ was crucified in the company of the good and bad thieves. How are we going to figure out which one of these is the real one? And so the story goes, just as they're pulling them out, a funeral is walking by, and so they decide to lower the crosses sequentially over the deceased person. First cross, nothing. Second cross, nothing. Third cross, the person comes to life, and they have, of course, rediscovered the cross of Jesus Christ. It's a fantastic story. By the way, look at the architecture. Doesn't it sort of remind you of Cubist painting or sort of early Impressionist Cézanne, perhaps, as well? Look at the precision of the architecture here on the right-hand side. All right. And then the end of the story, everyone, because it's such a great one. It's hard not to talk about all of it. But this cross that Helena rediscovers is left in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, where it remains until the 7th century, when the Sassanid emperor, whose name was Khosroes, steals it and actually mocks Christianity by essentially presenting himself seated on a throne. He's not there, he's down here, as God the Father. The cross represents God the Son, and he would use a rooster to represent the Holy Spirit. This angered, of course, the Byzantine emperor at the time, whose name was Heraclius, who defeats Khosroes in battle. Look at this crazy scene that Piero, he doesn't do movement well because he's too mathematical to do movement. His figures are almost sort of robotic, but what he does do well is this almost Mondrian kind of precision in the actual work. And here is Khosroes actually deposed, right? So you see the scene. And then finally, that cross is brought back into Jerusalem, and you see it being exalted here. All of this in the middle of Piero's career. He's really an astounding artist with an outstanding oeuvre, but you've noticed that nothing I've showed you thus far has been located in the city of Florence. Another of Piero's just strikingly beautiful works is his Madonna del Potto. This is one of my personal favorites, a detached fresco that is now in this former schoolhouse in this teeny tiny little town called Monterchi. Not too many people go out there, but if you do, be sure to stop by because the painting is just extraordinary. This image of this pregnant Madonna, which you don't see terribly often, but you see it here. And it's just so charming in its simplicity and in its intimacy as well, the way it's presented inside of this tent. In fact, if you look up here, you can see the pomegranate motif on the tent, which is symbolic, of course, of fertility. The pomegranate bursts forth, and each of its seeds can become a new pomegranate tree. Symbol, of course, also of Christ's passion. And the Madonna is just nothing less than stunningly beautiful in her youth and her innocence. This is not the Queen of Heaven. This is just a young maiden, almost uncertain and insecure in this, change, this important change that's happening in her life. Look at that face close up, which is just, and that's Piero. His faces are just stereotypically his. There's no other artist at this time who paints feminine beauty the way Piero actually does. You can even see the traces of pouncing of the cartoon transfer here around the neck. You see those little black dots there, which are just extraordinary. And how pregnant is she? Well, quite pregnant, because the Feast of the Expectation is celebrated on September 8th. And so she's about 3 months or so, 3.5 months away from delivery, with that hand over the dress, with the seam opening up as well to show us, of course, that she is nearing her delivery date. The angel here on one side, drawing back the ermine fur-lined tent. And then if you look at the other, you'll notice that that angel looks rather similar because it's the same angel. He's using the same cartoon backwards. And why not? Why go to the trouble of composing a brand new angel if you don't need one? And so you actually see him revert. Slight differences in the faces so that you can actually hide the fact that you're recycling it, but ultimately very similar. Notice as well the refraction of the lines in the inside of the tent in their actual halos. Talk about scientific precision. It's amazing how he does this in those halos. Okay, perhaps Piero's second most famous painting is his Resurrection, which is a fresco. So this is another one you have to hop in a car or some other type of transportation to go see, located where it always has been located, and that is City Hall. This is what it looks like isolated, the way we show you stuff. This is the way it looks like on the wall where he painted it 600 years ago. And I often have people look at me saying, is that it? Is that really it? Because they expect more of a Birth of Venus, more of a Pietà type of spectacular presentation with lights and laser beams and guards or what have you as well. And instead, nope, it's just stuck between those two corbels on this wall inside of the Museo Civico and depicts this extraordinary image of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Emerging from that, in fact, I just finished teaching an online course on Donatello, and I showed my students exactly the inspiration for this. It was one of Donatello's works done about the same time. This isn't Jesus levitating. This isn't Jesus supermaning up out of the tomb. This is Jesus firmly grounded and stepping out in this kind of eerie pre-dawn light that you see, almost Pet Cemetery-ish kind of representation as he stares straight out with his flag of victory. Blood, that's how fresh this is, still emanating there from his wounds as well. And then down below, of course, the sleeping soldiers. And the great irony was that they didn't want pagan eyes to be the first to lay sight on Jesus Christ, and so they put the soldiers to sleep. But in so doing, of course, could then support the theory that Jesus's body was stolen and not essentially brought back to life instead. And interesting, by the way, if you count up the number of people, there are 4, and if you count up the number of legs, there are 6. We're missing a set. Didn't really know where to work them in, and presuming that people like me wouldn't really waste their time looking for them. But you know what? We did. All right. All of this leading up to the flagellation. Now, ultimately, every painting I've shown you thus far has had a very clear-cut iconography. We know exactly what it is. And the reason we know exactly what it is because in the 15th century, it's always the same darn thing. It's a very limited amount of biblical information or biblical subject matter that is being depicted. Here, instead, what we get is the essentially image of the flagellation on the left-hand side, where Christ is being whipped, which is recognizable enough. But again, these other characters that you see in the scene who really don't have any particular role in the overall image itself. Now, to increase the mystery, if you will, or the confusion behind this completely, we have the image there without its border. So that technically you can actually see the painting here without its frame. And in so doing, you can actually not see what was once there, and that was an inscription with the words convenerunt in unam. Convenerunt in unum. They came together. This is the idea. And that somehow this inscription was tied into the meaning of the actual painting itself. And so art historians have tried for centuries to figure out exactly what the meaning of the work is, proposing several different theories as regards the image. So let's pull the painting apart just a little bit here. Here on the far left, we actually have the flagellation, which is perhaps the most recognizable portion of it all. Christ bound to the column, the pagan idol above his head, and his 2 torturers here lifting up their whips. The figure here with his back to us with a turban on his head, who of course doesn't fit in historically to the meaning of the actual work, because the crucifixion or the flagellation happened at a time when technically the religion that we call Islam did not exist. And then here you have this figure wearing a Byzantine cap, actually looking onto the scene. And then below the actual base there of the throne, we have the signature of the artist. And so clearly Piero wanted us to know that he was the artist responsible for it. So work of Piero of Borgo Santi Sepolcri, of Borgo San Sepolcro, which is his hometown. And that character that you see there with that weird hat is generally accepted to be a portrait of the Byzantine emperor John Palaeologus. All right. Now, John Palaeologus, who was a very important figure in 15th century Europe, in the Eastern Christian world as well, specifically for his role in trying to maintain the Byzantine Empire and the security of Constantinople himself. And consider that John Palaeologus had actually traveled to Florence way back in 1439 as part of the Council of Florence. This was the last time that Eastern and Western Christianity tried to amend their differences and come back together in the face of the Ottoman advance. And in fact, decided to do just that. But when Palaeologus went back and told his Greek subjects that that was what was going on, they changed their minds. And in this chapel located in the Medici Palace in Florence, there actually is a portrait of John Palaeologus, who was a guest of the Medici there. And so the idea, the Medici, of course, showing off their role in geopolitics at the time, because they were hosting characters as important as John Palaeologus in the actual scene. So what does all of this have to do in the background with the 3 figures here in the foreground? And the answer is we really have no idea. All right. Now, here are the 4 perhaps most valid theories concerning the meaning of this painting. And that is that the flagellation in the back is somehow connected to the 3 figures in the front. And that these 3 figures are in fact portraits of Odantonio da Montefeltro, who is the half-brother of this guy, the Duke of Urbino, Federico da Montefeltro, and that the other 2 men are Manfredo di Pio and Tommaso di Guido del Agnello. Now, I'm reading these names because these are not names that I use very often. All three of them had been assassinated. There'd been this uprising, this conspiracy against them, and that perhaps the Duke of Urbino had commissioned the painting as a type of allegory to commemorate this particular attempt. But this would go against an agreement that this man made with the people of Urbino, that all would be forgotten, that the matter would not be brought up again if, in fact, they decided to make him, Federico da Montefeltro, the Duke of the city. All right? Another theory is that the painting is an allegory, technically, of essentially the fall of Constantinople. In other words, that the city was being laid siege to here by the figure that you see, Murad II. He was the Sultan before Mehmed II, who actually took Constantinople in 1453. And so the idea that somehow this was tied into the inevitable fall, or shortly thereafter the fall instead, and that perhaps this was an attempt to get this guy, the Duke of Urbino, to understand what was happening to Christianity, as represented by the scourging of Jesus Christ, to get involved. The only problem is that none of these three guys look like the Duke of Urbino. Another theory is that this is actually the Duke of Mantua, or the Marquis of Mantua, excuse me, Ludovico III Gonzaga. This is his astrologer, and the figure between them is this sort of symbol of a sun. They both just lost sons within a very short period of time, and that somehow the unnecessary loss of youthful life is being reflected here by the flagellation of Jesus Christ in the background. But that, it's a nice theory, but there's really no substance behind it. In particular, this gentleman here with the forked beard and the hat looks specifically Byzantine in appearance. But the robe that you see here on the right has really no common presence in either Western or Eastern art. So more than likely, these figures might just be fantastical instead. But the fact really just boils down to essentially the idea that because we have a conventional subject in the back and three kind of extraneous, some might even say superfluous figures in the front, that it's just thrown us for such a loop that for the last 6 centuries, all we've done is to try to find some kind of hidden encrypted code in the painting that would in fact reveal its particular meaning. And unfortunately, it appears that we're no closer to it today than we were in the 15th century when the painting was first executed. All right. So folks, with that, I'm going to finish up. I know we want to leave some time for questions, so I'll be happy to field those questions should you have them.
All right. Well, we've got a lot of questions, so we'll dive right in. A fair number of questions about kind of technique and materials. So let's start with some of those. First question is, when we looked at that representation of the resurrection, the colors are really vivid. Has it been restored, or why is it in such good shape?
Yeah, the restoration. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do, of course, with these paintings being well conserved in Italy. And so the colors stay incredibly vivid. A lot of it has to do, of course, with the surrounding conditions as well. So if you combine a relatively well-maintained environment with effective conservation and restoration, then it is amazing how good these paintings can look considering their age.
And kind of diving a little deeper into the technique of Piero della Francesca, what kind of materials is he using? Is he using particular pigments? Is it what are his materials that are creating these works?
So he's using the same materials that everyone else is at the time. So the painting, for instance, you're looking at right now is tempera on wood panel. And so what that means is pigments suspended in egg yolk and then applied to a prepared wooden panel, usually poplar in Tuscany. That was the preferred wood for these panel paintings. And the fresco, again, is traditional, what we call in Italian, buon fresco, which means pigments suspended in water and then applied to wet plaster. Remember, fresco is the Italian word for fresh. So a fresco painting is essentially the application of watercolor to wet plaster. And there's a chemical reaction, it's called carbonization, where the pigments become one and the same. The major advantage of fresco painting, everyone, is its longevity. If the relative humidity of the masonry upon which it's executed is low, right now, the oldest frescoes in the world are the 20,000-year-old cave drawings in Lascaux, France, where some Neanderthal drew on a wall rich in calcium carbonate and created an unconscious fresco. So obviously, if done well and if done in proper circumstances, they can last a long time.
Want to turn back to the Montefeltro altarpiece for a second. So you spoke about the egg suspended from the ceiling. One of our attendees is posing a different theory, and she wants to know, is it possible that instead of an egg, it's a pearl, because the sort of architectural surroundings looks like a shell? So how do we know it's an egg? Is that the kind of thing we see normally in churches? Is there some support for that? What do you think?
It looks like an egg. It doesn't look like a pearl.
Yeah.
If it looks like an egg, then it usually is. I don't mean to, it just casts as often. This is my own kind of personal and professional frustration that oftentimes we can conflate theories in art history. Katie, you know what I'm talking about, where suddenly something that looks like a garbage can transformed into this work of art, what have you. Say, no, it's a garbage can. It looks like an egg. And to be honest, for me, the proof that it is an egg lies in the fact that the meaning of the image of the egg, which is one of birth and rebirth, is tied into that of the shell. And the idea that technically the shell becomes a kind of symbolic womb, if you will, inside of which or from which things are actually born. So that for me is this kind of inconfutable proof that technically it's an egg because it ties into that shell. I get the pearl thing. I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think that they would emphasize that particular aspect of the pearl hidden within it more than the idea of a kind of maternal setting for this notion of birth and rebirth.
Right. Turning to some of the textiles that we see, especially the guy here on the far right with his fantastic robe. Can you speak a little bit to the sort of vividness of the colors, as well as anything we might be able to discern about maybe his identity or any references that we might be expected to get based on the design or anything else?
No, if I did, then I say that bluntly, everyone, but I could provide you with, thousands of pages of academic literature on this particular painting. I still remember when I'll tell you one quick personal story. When I was a teaching assistant, we had to teach a particular Renaissance work of art. And I'll never forget, we had to choose from a list of potential topics. I chose the lecturing in Urbino, where this painting is located. And my motivation behind it was because our professor at the time told us that they had this great meal. We all went to this restaurant afterwards. And so for me, that was incentive. And I remember not knowing much about this painting and then realized that I'd really just bitten off much more than I could chew, because there's just an infinite amount of literature regarding the meaning of this little thing. I mean, this is 2.5 by 2 feet. And you're looking at it and saying, well, it's just a flagellation, but it can't just be a flagellation in the 15th century. I didn't get into the minutia, everyone, because I think otherwise then it almost turns you off. But look at the multiple light sources. How is it that this section is illuminated by its own light source that has nothing to do with the light falling into the painting from the other part? The perspective is mind-blowing. I mean, this is the stuff of hallucinations. Look at the converging orthogonals and the complexity of the tiles down there as well. The railing of the staircase behind in the doorway ties into the perspectival construction. This has been, computers have gone mad with this, trying to figure out exactly how the mathematical space ties into the meaning as well. Because there's that whole aspect I didn't explore because it gets quite tedious, I think, to a lay audience. But we don't know. And again, the drapery that he's wearing does not correspond to what typical drapery was in either the Eastern or Western Christian world at the time. Why is this guy barefoot while the other two seem to have leggings on? He looks Byzantine. In fact, he sort of looks like that gentleman with the Byzantine beard, but some say he's an astrologer, he's a philosopher instead. It's this intentionally ambiguous, and I think that's part of it, that in a local scene, it may have made sense. There might have been some kind of literary accompaniment. We don't know who the patron was. That might help as well. We're not really sure how it got to Urbino. Was it acquired? Was it from some other context? And all of that lack of contextual information makes it even more mysterious for us, because we have no real starting point except for contemporary events. And ultimately, that's what we fall back on.
Well, we're just about out of time for today. So can you give us a quick preview of what we're gonna chat about next week?
Okay, so the Duke of Urbino, who was one of our protagonists today, is in fact tied in to our theme next week, which is the plot to kill the Medici, the famous Pazzi conspiracy of 1478. And another of the conspirators was a gentleman named Pope Sixtus IV, whose real name was Francesco della Rovere. So we're going to connect the Duke of Urbino with Pope Sixtus, who gave his blessing for an assassination attempt on the brothers Magnifici, Lorenzo and Giuliano. And we'll see the two families, the della Rovere and the Medici, meet for the first time. And it sparks fly, to put it very simply. So I hope you'll join us all, because it's one of my favorite talks to give.
Fantastic. Well, please join us next Saturday at the same time. If you'd like to rewatch any part of today's lecture, you can always catch it on our YouTube channel for the California patrons. We'll also send out a link afterwards. And of course, if you'd like to learn more about how to support art restoration at either the Vatican Museums or the Uffizi Gallery, you can visit those websites at californiapatrons.org and friendsoftheuffizigallery.org. And of course, we'll send those to you as well. Thanks so much for being with us today, Rocky. Thank you.
You're very
Terrific
welcome,
as
everyone.
always. We'll see you
It's a
next
pleasure.
time.
We'll see you next week, everyone. Take care.